UN Day for Victims of Torture is coinciding with the day when the UN Convention Against Torture was signed and came into force. And it is, I think, a very appropriate moment to have a public discussion also with a broader audience about what are the stakes at the moment in the fight against torture. And maybe I should start by introducing myself. My name is Gerald. I'm the Secretary General of the World Organization Against Torture, OMCT. The World Organization Against Torture, for those who are not familiar with us, is a global civil society network against torture with a small secretariat fighting against torture in Geneva and offices in Tunis and Tripoli these days, but in particular with partner organizations around the world, because in the end of the day we believe that if you want to fight torture effectively, we need strong civil society actors in the countries concerned who can fight against torture and who can make a difference on the ground. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event, which is with the university in partnership with the University of Vienna, the Austrian League for Human Rights, and the Juridicum, if I'm not mistaken. I should also say that this event is part of a series of events that takes place today on June 26, celebrating or commemorating the fight against torture in various parts of the world. And we will also have a webcast that live screens this event to other parts of the world. So I think the idea of this event was very clearly also in relation to what is happening at the moment in Vienna, because we are 20 years after the Vienna World Conference in '93, and we are 25 years after the coming into force of the Committee Against Torture, the main body overseeing the implementation by states of the UN Convention Against Torture. So I think it's an appropriate moment to convene in Vienna and also to see what progress have we made and where do we stand in the fight against torture. Let me briefly introduce my panelists that are next to me, and I start on the very right, Mrs. Edita LINTL, who is in the management team of HEMAYAT, and I think you will be able to explain more what the organization is doing. But as I understand it, it's a trauma center that directly deals in rehabilitation work, therapy work with victims of war and trauma, and in particular torture. So I think it's very important when we talk about the UN Day for the victims of torture that we have this understanding what it actually does to people that are tortured around the world. Next, we have Professor Manfred NOWAK, that I think here in Vienna and elsewhere I don't really have to introduce. He's, as you know, Professor for International Law here at the University in Vienna, Director of the Boltzmann Institute, but in our world very much also known and credited for an amazing work he has done as former UN Special Rapporteur on torture. I think at the time after 9/11, when the UN when the absolute prohibition of torture was challenged, maybe like it wasn't before. So I think there would be many other attributes I can say, but I think you all know who Manfred is, and I'm very pleased that you are with us here today. And next to my right, Henri. Henri is a human rights lawyer and activist from India. He's also leading today one of the main regional human rights organizations, Forum Asia. He's a member of the executive committee of the World Organization Against Torture, but he's above all an activist in India who has his own organization called People's Watch, who does very good work on torture, but also on human rights education. And he will be able to share with us, I'm sure, an Asian perspective, but also a perspective of a human rights offender on the ground who is working on torture, not always under easy circumstances. And with that introduction, I would like to start the discussion. We would like to have rather than speeches, more a debate, first with the panel for a certain period of time, and then leave sufficient time for questions from you so that we have more of an exchange about the topic today. Manfred, this morning you spoke at a civil society meeting commemorating 20 years Vienna in '93. If you look at it, we have the absolute prohibition of torture under international law, maybe one of the most protected norms. Is it one of the most neglected ones at the same time? Have we made progress after Vienna?
Shall we use the...
I think it goes on automatic.
Yes, we have made progress. I would say. I think if you look in the fight against torture, in my opinion, the biggest achievement in those last 20 years was the adoption of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. As you know, it goes back to 1980 or the 1970s, Costa Rica Protocol, to establish a preventive mechanism for the prevention of torture by means of unannounced visits to all places of detention. At that time, the United Nations felt it was not yet ready to do that, so that's why we originally went to the Council of Europe, having the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture. But then during the 1990s, actually, we got back to the Commission on Human Rights, and it took some time. And it was an impasse. It was really difficult because the West in particular said, we really want the same as we have in Europe on a worldwide basis. And all the others more or less said this is unrealistic to have one. I mean, it costs a lot of money to have one committee that visits 190 states, and there all the places of detention doesn't work. And all of a sudden, Mexico came up with this beautiful compromise. At that time, it was seen as a compromise between the South and the European Union, but I see it not as a compromise. I see it as a major development. I think that OPCAT is much better than the European Convention, because it doesn't only have the subcommittee for the prevention of torture doing the same work, but the obligation of states to establish independent and effective national preventive mechanisms. And we are in the middle of the implementation process to really establishing effective national preventive mechanisms. And I'm deeply convinced that these will have a major impact on reducing torture and ill treatment, but in particular also improving conditions of detention. Whether the situation on the ground got better or worse, it's difficult to say. Usually I'm optimistic, but on the basis of my experience as a special rapporteur on torture, I think that the situation didn't get better. I'm afraid, so my conclusions after 6 years and 18 fact-finding missions to all regions in the world and many other activities is that in 17 of the 18 countries I found torture, which is much more. Amnesty usually says, I don't know, 60, 80, whatever countries. I would say if this is a representative sample, then we are talking about 150, 160 countries in the world where there is torture today. And I would say certainly more than half of the states where torture is more than an isolated phenomenon as in Austria. It is a widespread or even systematic practice. And that's a terrible conclusion after 6 years of having been special rapporteur on torture. But for me, even more devastating was to see how the conditions of detention are. So I met so many people whom you ask if you go to a prison, and you just ask them, as we did, and some of my team members are sitting here from the Boltzmann Institute of Human Rights who went with me on mission. You ask people, have you been tortured? And then the answer is, of course, everybody has been tortured here. Whenever you are picked up by the police, they torture you. That's a usual practice. But compared to what we are suffering since then, this was nothing. It was 3 days torture, not nice, terrible. But now, having spent 5 years in this totally overcrowded, unhygienic, devastating kind of places of detention, dirty, no access to health, no access to food, no access to nothing. That is in reality much worse than 3 days of torture in order to extract a confession. So for me, that was the most serious, and for me also to some extent surprising, findings that the conditions of detention worldwide definitely have not improved, but the other way around. So I think worse, there's much more overcrowding, and there are many reasons for that. One is the so-called war on drugs. In many countries, prisons are full with drug users because not only the United States and the Russian Federation, many other states think that drug users are not to be treated but to be locked away. But also, of course, on the so-called war on terror, that we have so many people spending their time in prison because they are accused of perhaps being a terrorist or somewhere related to terrorism, etc. So, of course, also 9/11 had a very important negative effect on the absolute prohibition of torture and the fight against torture. So the first 10 years of this century were kind of a lost decade. But I hope that the second decade will be more positive in the fight against torture and for human rights in general.
Thanks, Manfred. I think you raised already a number of points on which I think we probably will come back in the discussion, the role of some of these treaties, what is their impact. I think 9/11 and what stays as an impact is probably a discussion we want to take up in a second round. Let me move for a moment to Henri, also with a similar question. At the time of the World Conference 93 in Vienna, there was a real challenge to the universality of human rights coming from Asian states. And it involved also the questioning that some of the values like the universal prohibition, torture, cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment might not be as universal. Is that a challenge that is, in your view, something of the past? And would you share the perspective of Manfred that, yes, we've made progress, but in terms of real prevention of torture, the issue stays?
Well, speaking after Manfred is a little difficult. But I would like to give a perspective from the ground. And the reality on the ground in terms of many Asian states, in particular South Asia from which I come, the reality from the ground is horrible. As you said, if there is a person who has been to a police station and gone there categorically for an investigation, in the country I come from, there is no chance that he or she was not tortured. We did a study as a part of our national project on preventing torture in India, covering about 9 states and 47 districts. And the projections we made from that study for the entire country was, and the figures were shocking, 1.8 million cases of torture per year taking place in the 620 districts of our country. And this report was the report that was presented in Copenhagen in the extradition case of the the arms dropping case, which has become a very diplomatic issue between India and Denmark, and we are paying the price for it in a different way. We come from also a very violent society, which is projected internationally as a non-violent society, and we need to break this myth. India is a very violent society. We have institutions that are built in which makes it violent. The family is violent. The family is not a non-violent family. The woman is battered at home. We come from a caste society, and therefore caste is very violent. And the violence of caste has to be experienced and seen to be understood. We come from a situation of classrooms in schools which are very violent, and corporal punishment in schools is normal. Children losing their eyes, children committing suicide, children dying out of shock of what happened in the classroom against her or him, however young they are in the classroom, is something normal. And therefore, if this is the normal scenario, you can imagine the scenario in the police station. Everyone expects the police to be handling people violently. Nobody expects the police to be handling people non-violently. And therefore, this larger acquiescence of the public to torture is something which has also permeated the judiciary. The judges in a training program organized by the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, which is an international human rights organization, of district judges, where I happened to be invited, sitting with some judges who are now in the Supreme Court. When questioned at the end of the session of one day whether they believe there can be any investigation without torture, 98% of district judges said, how can it happen that there can be investigation without torture? And if that is the judiciary, you can imagine how prevalent it is. Therefore, while we agree on the ground, the poorer are the people who are actually the victims of torture, and therefore not in a position to make use of all these international developments that were listed out by Mr. Manfred. They are not aware of it. Neither does the legal aid system anywhere help them in making sure that cases of torture are taken off. And if somebody escapes from torture, he or she believes it prudent in terms of common life to ensure that they don't speak about it, rather than speak about it and try to challenge those who are responsible for torture. But this is the scenario on the ground in almost all South Asian countries that I come from. And therefore, the situation now is worse because our criminal justice system is also not able to manage. And therefore, with a functioning criminal justice system which is almost collapsing, then the fight against torture becomes extremely difficult because it is not within the ambit of law that this can be questioned in most of the South Asian countries, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Maldives, Nepal, etc.
Thanks, Henri. I think it's interesting also that you say the victims of torture, those who are suffering torture, are very often people from marginal communities, the poor. So it is not only in the context of security or in the context of political repression, but in very ordinary cases. And maybe let me turn to Mrs. LINTL in this regard. You're working with victims directly that come here, I assume primarily from outside Austria, but maybe there are also people, Austrians who are coming that, I don't know. Yeah. From your perspective, can you see who are the victims, what type, what are their expectations for treatment here, what are the experiences? Do we see a change in the type of people that come to us?
Well, the change we see, it's getting worse and worse. First of all, I have to say, I just arrived from a children therapy session, and there was one girl from Afghanistan, 10 years old. She gave me a plaster, and I can say about this girl got tortured in Afghanistan. She was held in a shelter, no food, no water. She started to eat her skin, and she had to look a video from her father. The father got tortured and they shot them, and she had to look at the video again and again and again. So thank God she is now here in Austria. She has therapy since 2 years, and she gave me today this plaster and said, please give it to another child who needs maybe more help than I do. So I thought that was a really very touchy story. And the thing is, we are HEMAYAT. I mean, HEMAYAT is an Arabic word. It says protection and care. We care, or we give psychological help for refugees and also, of course, victims of torture. We started in 1995, and in 2012 we helped, 695 people. But still, the waiting list is enormous. There are still waiting 230 people for therapy. That's a lot. And the telephone is ringing every day, especially children and young people. Yeah. And the thing is that the most of the people come from Chechnya, Afghanistan, Iran, also Africa, Armenia, and at the moment we see also a lot of people come back from ex-Yugoslavia. They well, they had some treatments, but they started to work. They had a normal life, let's say normal, and now they went in pension and they have a lot of time. They can think, and they come back because the trauma started again. So trauma is not something like it doesn't hit everybody. I mean, you can. Let's say you are a refugee and you got tortured and you come to Austria and you think, well, I'm fine. There are a lot of people around us, we don't know they got tortured. But after a while, something happened, they got triggered, and then it's really terrible. And our work is quite, well, frustrating also, because we see that people get sometimes better, but we can't take the trauma away. We can stabilize them. We can help them to get a bit life back. And the thing is, when we started, there was over there something felt, right? Yeah. I mean, that happens daily in our therapies. There is smashing a door. There is somebody screaming in another room. These people, I mean, they get triggered all the time. And we try. The trauma work is a very sensible work. We can't say, okay, come 10 hours and you are healthy again. It doesn't work like that. There are some people who are coming for a therapy, I guess, 2 or 3 years. It takes a really long time. And you can't push them. You can't say, please tell me about your trauma. Please tell me about how did you get tortured. I want to know everything. Never do that. We always say the client is the chief. He or she tells us what you want to tell, what happened. And that can take a long time. But the thing is, the first thing what's for us is very important to find some resources to get some dignity back, self-confidence. And the thing is, to work as a therapist, we have to go through hell with the client together. And then we can start slowly and building it up. But still, I mean, sometimes you think you work 1 year with a client, you think everything is fine. And then something happened, let's say Chechnya, something, the aunt or your uncle died, and everything is, we can start again. And that's maybe what I told you before. It's also when we think we can, well, the thing is, when some clients, they say, I really feel better. I'm not thinking anymore about death. I want to see my children grown up. But then they get one day a letter from the asylum court. And then we start again, because we call this also a re-traumatization. That people are afraid to send back to their country. I mean, even in Chechnya at the moment, it's a really big problem. Everybody knows you can't send anyone back to Chechnya. And in Austria, we do, constantly. So, yeah. The thing is, the worst thing about HEMAYAT is sometimes I think, I wish there would be no, we don't need HEMAYAT, but we definitely do. And it's getting worse and worse for us.
Thanks for that explanation. I think it shows the human price that we sometimes, especially some of us like me who are lawyers, we speak very abstract, and I think there's a very, very concrete dimension to all of this. And I think it's an amazing work that is done that is very difficult, and it's also very difficult for the people doing it who themselves need also the support in this work, not only the financial support but also the psychological support. Yeah. It's difficult to go to a more abstract level back in a way, and maybe I go towards you, Manfred. You spoke about detention. The one issue you haven't mentioned is impunity. How important is the fight against impunity for the enforcement of the absolute prohibition on torture, and how can we, is there a magic that we can cut the Gordic knot to finally have accountability for torture? How can we overcome that lack of accountability?
It's again not a success story. The very purpose, the very reason why the United Nations Convention Against Torture was adopted in 1984 was to use criminal law in order to fight impunity for torture. And it was coming from Latin America, military dictatorships all over the place, systematic torture, although torture had already been absolutely prohibited. Jus cogens, the highest norm in international law. So the idea was not to have a new prohibition of torture, but a specific convention in order to make the fight against torture more effective. And the most important element is, and it's for the first time in a human rights treaty, it was borrowed from the anti-terrorism, hijacking and these kind of conventions, an obligation of every state, and we have about 150 states that ratified the Convention Against Torture, to criminalize. So to make torture as defined in the convention a crime with appropriate penalties, taking into account the seriousness of the crime of torture. So not half a year, or as in Austria, 2 years or so, but really it's a very violent crime, similar to other violent crimes, robbery, armed robbery, or homicide. That is the idea. First of all, to torture, to establish the crime of torture. Second, have a very broad jurisdiction, not only the territorial state, but also the personality principle. So every state has an obligation to make torture a crime. So Austria ratified, so must make a crime that every Austrian who tortures wherever in the world should be brought before an Austrian court. And even the principle of universal jurisdiction. So whenever somebody is coming to Austria from anywhere in the world, and there's enough evidence that this person tortured somewhere else, has nothing to do with Austria, we have an obligation to arrest the person, conduct a preliminary investigation, and then either extradite the person to another state where we can be sure that this other state would exercise jurisdiction, and if not, it's an obligation to bring the person to justice before our own criminal courts. That's the idea. I tried as special rapporteur on torture, we did often to really try to find all the cases in which perpetrators of torture have been brought to justice. I think you still can count them on the fingers of your two hands. Universal jurisdiction more or less doesn't work. We have a few cases in the United Kingdom, we have a few cases in Belgium, but it's not necessarily for torture. It has not been accepted. And for me, why? Because states simply do not feel that torture is a serious crime. So time and again, I discussing with chiefs of prison directors or police chiefs, or asking them. So when we enter, we ask them, how many cases of torture did you have in the last 5 years? And of course the answer is always torture, no, never heard of. Of course, doesn't exist. And then the next question would be, but what are you doing if you find out as a chief of police that under your supervision there might be a case of torture? No, it doesn't happen. But in case it would happen, what would you do? No, we take it very, very seriously. I mean, torture is a very serious issue. So what would you do then, actually? What is, sanctions. This really, people need to be sanctioned. But what kind of sanction? And then they think, and they said, perhaps for a year they wouldn't get any kind of increase in their salary, or perhaps a slight disciplinary punishment for. So it's this, and it's this kind of feeling. Torture is exactly what you said. everybody expects you to torture, so how can this be a serious crime? It's the normal practice. It's this daily routine. It's not the big political prisoners. It's the poor. Torture is a privilege of the poor. As poorer you are, as more likely it is that you are going to be tortured. If you are rich, you find all kinds of ways of bribe you out, you pay and whatever, you probably won't be tortured. But for poor people, that's the normal way it is. So how can this be a serious crime? So this was 1984 that it was adopted. It was a big success. We said, now finally we are fighting impunity. 30 years later, we have to say it failed. We have, of course, international criminal courts now, and the ones who are systematically practicing torture, some of those people are now brought before the International Criminal Court or the special tribunals. But on a domestic level, that states would really take it seriously and bring their own people or people who committed torture on their own territory or under universal jurisdiction to justice is very, very seldom. And the Hissène Habré case is just one example of showing Senegal does for Hissène Habré, is the former president of Chad, who systematically tortured and killed and whatever in the 1980s. He was overthrown in 1990, yes, and he immediately went to Senegal. And now for more than 20 years, civil society, Human Rights Watch, Podium, and many others are trying just to tell Senegal, but you have an obligation under the Convention Against Torture to bring him to justice. Senegal did whatever they could to avoid it. Even Belgium asked for extradition. They said, no, we don't want to extradite you to Belgium. But we ask it's an African Union thing. So they asked the African Union whether they could take care of Mr. Habré. They said, no, you have to do it. So even they went to the International Court of Justice. So, but it's kind of, we have to avoid it because it's an unfriendly act if we in Senegal bring the former president of Chad to justice for torture. So it simply doesn't work.
Thanks, Manfred. It doesn't give much hope, does it? And it reminds me, you said states do not feel, at least this is not what they would say publicly, but underlying is that they don't feel that torture is as serious as a crime, like some of the other crimes that are completely outlawed under international law, slavery, etc. I remember when I went the first time to India, I was told by an Indian police commissioner who said, we have the problem that the authorities believe that we have to protect the morale of the troops, and this is why we can't prosecute crimes of torture. And then he questioned, why should it be good for the morale of the troop to protect a rapist, a torturer, etc.? Henri, is there a way that we change that culture, that perception? Or have we to give up on the idea of fighting impunity? India is a country that praises itself to have a very sophisticated legal system. Isn't there some hope?
Well, I come from a country in which the Supreme Court has ruled the best possible rulings in terms of abolishing of torture. So in terms of the Constitution, in terms of the judgments of the court, we are quite high. But yet, it was only in 1997 that we signed the Convention Against Torture. And we have still not ratified the Convention Against Torture. So on the one hand, you have a legal regime within the country which abolishes torture, a constitution which abolishes torture. And on the other hand, in terms of international commitment, in spite of all our pledges that we make to walk into the Human Rights Council, we are yet to ratify the Convention Against Torture. We still don't have a torture prevention law in the country. In 2011, there was a horrible draft that was brought in. Civil society managed to thwart it when it came to the upper house. We came to you at that point of time and said, you must rush to the country. Luckily, you did not rush because our parliament doesn't work most of the time. And therefore, although the standing committee of the upper house has a good draft now, we don't have a torture prevention law. Our first round of UPR recommendations, we had agreed that the torture law would be in place. We have gone to the second UPR recommendations and still the law is not there. So that is as regards the law. Now the sign of hope. 15 years ago, I used to believe that it was worth talking to policemen. I used to undertake training programs for policemen, thinking that this conversation with policemen whom we used to fight otherwise in terms of concrete cases would ultimately lead to a process of some hope somewhere. Till after a few years, we came to know that while policemen on the one hand were inviting people like us to address the forces, the moment we left, they had another session with prosecutors, which was after a small gap to make sure we were out of the campus, which we were not aware of, which was precisely to make sure that the policemen on the ground knew exactly how to combat all the arguments against torture that we had made. And it is after witnessing this, I said, never again a session for policemen. So do you have hope? We have hope only in making sure that public opinion against torture is built. And public opinion against torture is what will then force the state and its instrumentalities to look at the issue of torture as an offense in criminal law. Even the National Human Rights Commission of India, which is a very prestigious institution because it is headed by a former Chief Justice of our country, even the National Human Rights Commission has in its last 20 years of its existence, not in cases of torture, recommended prosecution to the perpetrators of torture. We have cases before the... So your sign of hope should be laid somewhere. If it is not in the force, it should be in the courts, it should be in the National Human Rights Institution in the country. You don't have that sign of hope in these institutions being able to ensure trust that the regime will follow. And therefore, I think civil society work among victims of torture and propagating that work publicly, speaking publicly, using the media, looking at issues of rehabilitation of victims of torture, these are the signs of hope that the system would change, and not hoping that the law enforcement officials on their hand or the judiciary by itself would be the vanguard in the combat against torture. I think the signs of hope are more in civil society engagements, and that you see. But if you engage in torture, you have to be sure that as a human rights defender, you are willing to pay the price. Because those who take on security forces, those who take on law enforcement officials are not going to be let go in the process. So you will see people who combat victims of torture on the border of Bangladesh and West Bengal for years together with all sorts of reports, regular reports to the Special Rapporteur on Torture, regular urgent appeals to you, Masum, Kirti Roy, fights the same battle for the last several years, and more people who cross the border for very, very practical economic reasons of moving from Bangladesh with one cow here to sell in West Bengal or something like that for his livelihood are the people who are tortured or are the people who are killed. And those cases continue in spite of all these interventions. So the signs of hope are in civil society organizations like Masum, in different parts of the country, different actors who persistently, doggedly continue to take up cases of torture. And I think the signs of hope are there rather than the system really developing into protecting people who are victims of torture.
I think that's an interesting perspective, that it's, in the end, it's us, it's the public in a way who has to call for accountability, who has to call for the fight against torture. And you speak about the victims as well, and this leads me again to ask you, what else can we do to show more the fate of those who suffer torture, to speak about victims and survivors and to give them a face? Is that a way forward? And would...
Well, the problem is that you can't, what I said before, you can't see if someone has a trauma, if someone is a victim of torture. You don't know it. Eh? These people are around us. But what we can say is that victims of torture have a diagnosis for 100% is post-traumatic stress disorder. And it means this are quite different symptoms. It could be aggression, yeah? It could be numb, it could be, or it is, physical problems. Concentration problem is a very, very big problem. And the thing is, the state of Austria says, learn German. But we know these people, they even get out of the room and they don't know, do I have to go right or left? Where is my child? They forget everything. That's a typical symptom of PTBS, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So, or teachers call us because the children have behavioral syndromes, very normal. And then they say, okay, this child can't go back to school. So, you know, it's a circle of problems we have to deal with. And also depression, panic attacks, I mean, so go on. There is a lot of symptoms where we think, oh, get a life. But, I mean, these people have a real problem. And I do want to quote a psychotherapist, Dr. Becker. He said, I mean, if you look at the word post-traumatic stress disorder, we see the word disorder. Yeah? So we say this woman or man or child has a disorder. And we say that's not true. It's not a disorder. It's not the client. The sick client is a sick system, a system where they come from. And it's also a sick system in Austria. I mean, how can you say to someone, he's waiting here for 10 years for his asylum, and he can't work, he can't do anything? I mean, you get really sick from such things. And if you are depressive, I mean, you get other symptoms. Years after years, we see they get worse and worse. They live with 5 children in a room like 2 square meters. And they can't do nothing. And we see, the other thing of post-traumatic stress disorder is that we see that the clients go often to the doctor. They always think they die on a heart attack, or they have a lung embolia or whatever. They found always new diagnosis on himself. But the doctor says, you are healthy. Yeah? Your body is healthy. Go to, get another way of help. So, and the problem is that a lot of people from different cultures, like Chechnya or even, every country, they don't know what psychological help is. So that makes it also very difficult, because when they feel their heart, they think they get a heart attack, but they can't make the click that it has to do something with your mind. You know? So that makes it so complicated. And we think Austria could save a lot of money if they would spend more money in this kind of help, yeah? And not making every month a scan of someone where we know the heart is just fine. It's just hurt. I mean, not just, it's hurt.
Maybe just as a follow-up question, because we were also speaking about the impunity challenge and the quest for justice that on a technical legal level often doesn't work. How important is that in your experience for survivors of torture or similar abuses? How much is the quest for truth and accountability and justice part of the healing process?
Oh, thanks for asking this, because that's a very important thing. Our work as a therapist, the first thing is so important to tell them, I believe you. I really do. And every reaction is, thank you, thank you, thank you. You don't know what it helps me to hear that. Because we have been quite often to an asylum court, and it's so unbelievable what these people ask. And I mean, we know that when you have post-traumatic stress disorder, you have a memory problem. I always compare it with like an 8mm film, you know, in earlier time. I mean, there are a lot of young people, but when you put the film in and it makes, the film was broken. So in my case, it was my father. He started again to fix it. And okay, the movie is going on, but you lost something. the movie is not intact anymore. And that's exactly the same what happens into the mind of these people who have this symptom. And when they sit at a civil court and this man is asking you, well, tell me, how happened the torture? Tell me exactly, what did they do to you? I mean, it's awful. It's a completely re-traumatization. And these people can't talk about it. They can't say, you know, this and this and this happened to me, because most of the time they are speechless. And we as therapists, we are also speechless every day again. And it's so important that people respect and they listen to them and hear them and believe them. The first step to believe them is the first step to get better as far as possible.
Thanks a lot for that. And what I suggest is, before we make a round with questions also from the audience, we've heard quite a devastating picture, not only on what it takes on individuals that are affected, but also on the situation on the ground. So I'd like to ask, before we get to a series of questioning, I wanted to start with Henri and then Manfred, on what can be done. What needs to be done now that we tackle that problem?
I think this whole issue of combating torture has as years have gone by, lost larger allies in the human rights movement. And people engaged in different thematic engagements on human rights are not willing perhaps to also join the larger movement for combating torture. I think more and more we have seen that this community of people engaged in the fight against torture are being isolated. And this whole talk about economic, social, cultural rights, which we are all part of, has also sort of ensured that those who combat torture are put into a smaller circle of activists. And therefore, this, and we are trying in this whole UPR exercise, for example, is another occasion that gives us an opportunity to place the issue of combating torture in the larger realm of human rights issues in the country. Just as we are looking at the right to food, the right to health, the right to security, etc., the combat against torture is also put into a larger scenario, and there is some attempt in trying to see that your allies are built in the larger movement. I think that is something that really needs to be done today. And number two is that the combat against torture has to start from a very younger age. It has to start in school, where young children are told in categoric terms throughout their education in school that torture is a crime. Whether it happens in the house, in the bedroom, within the four walls of the house, whether it happens in the classroom, whether it happens in the police station. These are events that cannot be tolerated at all. I think this starts from a larger education base. Only then does it become part of a public culture, a public opinion that can be created in a country. And I think we have to invest on that. And the state is not always willing to invest. And we find that where we are able to invest on that, the scenario is quite different. I've simultaneously, very interestingly, been also engaging in promoting the teaching of human rights in schools. And if it starts at an age of 10, 11 to 14, I have seen boys and girls in school who go back and when they see violence in society, protest, because their teacher had imbibed in them a culture of wanting to protest. And I have the story of a boy who's with me today, but who was a student in class 7, who protested against an old lady who wanted to tell her daughter-in-law that the last girl child she had given birth to should be killed. And the boy said, no, I will not tolerate it, and went up to this old lady and challenged her. And the challenge came because the teacher was the embodiment of human rights for this boy. He was beaten. He went back. He came back again, this time with the mother, with the reassurance of the mother that Saturday and Sunday, it was a Saturday and Sunday you will look after that female child. And on Monday you will come with me to school and hand over that child to the teacher because the teacher would look after the child after that. And they came back to this old lady and told the lady, now please give this child whom you want to kill to my mother, who's a temporary caretaker only for 2 days. The permanent caretaker was the teacher who had brought this value of human rights to him at that age. And I think we need to invest more and more on such people because that is what will change the culture that we are talking about of torture that continues. And I think hope is there, and simultaneously the combating of torture and the promoting of human rights values at a very young age in cultures such as ours has to really continue.
So cultural change is one, I take it. The public involvement is another one. I'm sure, Manfred, we're both in this fight against torture. We believe that we can make a difference. If you are now meeting government officials and they ask you what needs to be done globally in the fight against torture, what do you tell them?
Let me perhaps start with a comparison. I do remember very well still when Amnesty International published its first global report on torture. It was in the early 1970s, and they said in 60 countries in the world, torture is practiced. And it was an outcry. It was people were really feeling, there was this idea, because in reaction to the Nazi experience, we outlawed torture. It's an absolute prohibition of torture. And people had the feeling torture is really kind of eradicated. Then it was, of course, French in Algeria, etc., but those were exceptions. And then were the Latin American dictatorships, and one said, this can't happen again. So we really have to do something. That's why so quickly the United Nations reacted, the Organization of American States and others. So the public awareness was this is something that can't be. I had the feeling when I really tried to do my best to present what I call the global study, so to base it on this experience. And in fact, I came up with a report saying in 17 out of 18 countries there is torture. In more than half of the countries in the world in the year 2010, there is widespread or systematic torture. I thought, I was so naive still, I thought there might be an outcry. And I presented this report to the Human Rights Council, and it was taken like any other report. There was half an hour of discussion, and that was it. I hoped there would perhaps be a resolution of the Human Rights Council saying, by the way, this is not such a nice report. Perhaps we should do something about this. Nothing. Zero. What does that mean? We are used that torture is a normal phenomenon. It's not anymore this idea, it's the most violent attack on the core of human dignity. We can say that 100 times. We are used to it. Of course, the so-called war on terror and all the ways how the Bush administration tried to justify torture in extreme circumstances, that all had a negative impact also on the fact that we try to get used, we have to live with torture. And even if the United States of America are torturing the torture is the lesser evil, so this kind of idea, why shouldn't, I mean, in so many countries, I was told, but why are you coming to us if even the United States is torturing? It's a normal way of dealing with crime or with terror. We also have terrorists, why shouldn't we torture as well? So it's kind of becoming a generally accepted behavior. So how do you fight that? I think it's probably much more difficult. I agree with you. It's an awareness raising process. Why am I so positive about the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture? Because, again, my experience is, and that is something I was not that much aware of it before, was that there is more or less no empathy by the public at large for those who are behind bars. There's always this kind of feeling, if you are imprisoned, if you are by the police, if you are in a psychiatric institution, there's something wrong about you. You must have done something wrong. So when I tried, one of my recommendations was we need an international convention on the rights of detainees. As we have an international convention on the rights of children, on the rights of persons with disabilities, detainees are among the most vulnerable people, whatever they have done. But they are most vulnerable because they are locked up, they can't defend themselves, they are the poorest, etc. And the reaction of the international community, I was together with Stephanie in Salvador de Bahia, and we tried at the UN Congress on Crime Prevention, we tried to really, together with a few Latin American states who were in favor, to push this idea. The reaction, in particular of not China. China was finally even in favor. It was the European Union and the United States of America who said, in times of financial crisis, why should we actually spend money for those who are behind bars? I think that's totally unrealistic, such a convention that costs money and whatever. There is no empathy. So the prison walls are not only to lock people away, but also to lock society out. The society, the most people on the street, they don't want to know what's going on behind bars. So that's why I feel the optional protocol, Nigel Rodley once said this, it's changing the paradigm of opacity by a paradigm of transparency, making closed institutions more open. And that's exactly what the national preventive mechanisms do, that people have access to prisons, access to police stations, access to psychiatric hospitals, access to old people's home. There's a lot going on of ill treatment in old people's home, in institutions for persons with disabilities, in children's home, in asylum and other detention facilities for migrants, etc., to just open them up, to show what is actually going on, I think is the best way of awareness raising among the public at large, that we have to do something about these conditions and, of course, about the way how people are treated. So that's why I think if you really create an effective national preventive mechanism in more or less every country in the world, it's not anymore the UN is supervising, the UN is coming, it's the own people and civil society in a well-functioning national preventive mechanism. Might be at an ombuds institution or at the Indian Commission on Human Rights, whatever, but the people should be from civil society. We need psychiatrists, we need other doctors, we need psychologists, we need nurses, we need whomever, a very, very broad interdisciplinary team to really look into and then report publicly what they have found. I think that might be something that changes awareness, which is most important.
So transparency is the best medicine for cure.
Yes.
And interesting also, I think, a point you make about the role of civil society, which matches a little bit my experience, having worked in particular in Eastern Europe, where you had, after the changes, very creative and progressive ways of civil society, systematic civil society monitoring of places of detention, including police station, which I think is indeed very important. Not only the state institution monitoring it, but also civil society. And also that you say public reporting, because that too, in my experience, is fundamental, so that also civil society organizations like yours, like the World Organization Against Torture, we can rely behind something that is public for the advocacy that is needed. Otherwise, it risks to stay in the system and not being acted upon. I remember years back in having worked on prison reform, and I met the Latvian prison director. And the European Convention Against Torture foresees also a visiting mechanism, the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture, and they came to Latvia. They had a devastating report about the prison conditions, and many people in the prison system, they knew that the system was sick and needed to be changed. But for as long as the report was not published, nothing happened. And it was only at the moment that Latvia decided to publish the report that suddenly there was support for prison reform. So he saw that as the starting point for anti-torture reforms in Latvia at the time. And I think it shows that transparency, access, but then also public reporting and accounting, I think, are key issues. I think there are many more issues we should address, but I would like to leave it at this point here and rather give to the audience. What I suggest is to collect a couple of questions together And I would ask you to introduce you very briefly, and also if you have a comment, to keep it brief. Even better if you have very specific questions. I have a gentleman to the right and then here to the left.
My name is Klaus Gernand. I'm a private individual living in retirement. I was surprised by the revelations of Mr. T of the violent nature of Indian society. I mean, we know about it in relation to Pakistan and to some of the other countries in the area. And I was particularly surprised by the statement that a lot of this violence is directed by police at simple and poor people. And I wonder, what is the police after in relation to these people? The second one is, we got a glimpse of the violent nature of Indian society, I think within the last year, in connection with those 2 terrible rape cases, where, as I see it, though, the population and foreign countries shamed the Indian police forces and courts to become active. Now, one doesn't hear much about this case. One heard about the beginning of a proceedings against these youths, but then it sort of fizzled out. Is it still going on, or are they trying to push it under the carpet?
Thank you. Maybe we collect a couple of questions and then Ian here. Any other question afterwards?
Thanks. Ian Siderman, International Commission of Jurists. As Gerald pointed out, you painted a very bleak picture, and on accountability in particular, you mentioned how, Manfred, for instance, how very few prosecutions actually take place, even where states do have torture criminalized. And of course, one of the main purposes of criminal law is to create deterrences and to stop. It's a preventive mechanism in that sense, but it doesn't work if nobody's being prosecuted. There's another, though, form of accountability that also may serve a deterrent function, possibly, which is the civil remedies. And in both the Torture Convention and in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, states are required to provide for civil remedies for acts of torture and to provide remedy and reparation, which includes not just money, but other forms of reparation like rehabilitation, apologies, the right to truth, etc. In your experience in India and globally, Manfred, is the picture a little brighter here? I mean, we know that states do tend to respect judgments coming from the European Court or the Inter-American Court when torture judgments come out. At domestic level, it's a bit patchier, but is this a more promising channel to work through? It's a bit softer because states are more willing sometimes because it's may just be money. It's not bringing their highest officials into prison. And should this be more of an emphasis for the international community in terms of not just creating justice for victims, but also as a deterrent to stop the practice? Thanks.
The lady behind you.
Hello, I'm Reena George. I have questions for all the 3 panelists. First to Edita, I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with listening to all these stories as a counselor? Because as researchers or as a rapporteur like Manfred, hearing stories of torture or trauma is quite stressful, and I would like to know, how do you deal with that as a counselor? Then to Manfred, you talked about overcrowding, unhygienic conditions as in relation with you being a rapporteur, and I was wondering, in juxtaposing overcrowding, unhygienic conditions versus torture, what do prisoners say, or detainees say, which violates their dignity more, whether it is torture or staying in these unhygienic conditions or overcrowded prisons? And I have two questions for Henri. One is, you said that there is a public opinion built in it. Also, but thank you for bringing the truth or breaking the myth that India is a non-violent society. And yeah, public opinion in India about torture, you say civil societies are changing things. But there is also this part called as collective conscience where everybody wants a rapist to be given death penalty. In this scenario, do you think just public opinion would change the situation or the laws related to torture? Shouldn't it be the legislature who should take initiative? And from what you said, there is really no hope on how they deal with things. The second thing is that as a human rights defender, you also mentioned Kirti Roy. He was arrested in some case. You being a defender, a human rights activist, do you also face this problem of being arrested on false charges? Because knowing the system in India or researching, even on death penalty, I know that the state hated me. So I'm sure I was just a small fly there. And you have been working there long, so what is the situation?
Thanks. I would suggest we take one more and then we give it to the panel and then we can have a second round.
My name is Melanie Oliver. I was just wondering how you think the asylum system should become more sensitive to trauma. My question is how the asylum system should become more sensitive to trauma, and also, or in the same breath, how to better balance the need to get information and determine credibility with the right to the victim not to be re-traumatized.
Thanks. I think we probably start with you, Edita, if you don't mind. I mean, there's the question that we just heard. There were other questions, I think, about how one deals with psychological impact, maybe also the right to rehabilitation.
Well, depends your question. It's difficult. I was thinking now when you ask it, and I mean, it's difficult to it's so different because sometimes we see, for example, there was a client, he came yesterday and he said he's a wonderful Chechen young man, really, I love him. And he got better and better and he stopped therapy because he said, I feel good, thank you. So the problem is now his mother died and she lives in Georgia and it's quite bad with him again. And he got extremely aggressive at his work. And someone called the police, and we don't have any good experience with police. But in that case, I have to say hallelujah, because this police, he recognized that this young man has post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said to him, please look for help and don't worry. And this was our first experience, no, actually our second experience with the police, where we thought maybe it's getting better and better. But at the whole SEAL system, it's quite different. It depends who is leading the how are you calling it, Gerichtsverfahren?
The criminal or the...
Thanks, yes.
Judicial proceeding.
And there are some people who want to listen and other ones, they already say, it's gone, yeah, you can go away. And we try to start afterwards to find a discussion with these persons, and it's every time, again, hard work. But I think if we find one of the 100 who believes the person and who understands what we are doing, I think it's okay. But we have to do a lot of work still. And what your question means, well, first of all, I studied to be able to handle it. I mean, but in the first way, I think you have to be quite positive, a positive person. Otherwise, I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of colleagues who get into burnout. It's yeah. it's there. But the thing is, for me personally, it sounds maybe stupid, but I get a lot of power. When I work with a client and I see he's getting better and better, he can talk about it, he finds back into life, it gives me so much strength. And that gives me the feeling, okay, it's good what we are doing every day again. The only thing is, I have to say also, we work with dolmetschers. So we have also a setting with dolmetsch client and myself or other colleagues. And we know it's really hard for dolmetschers because they don't have the education. And sometimes we have to deal with dolmetschers. They are not professionals, but they come from countries where, well, like in Africa, there are some dialects, and we are so grateful if we find someone who speaks the language. But they hear it, first of all, from the client, and then they have to translate it to the therapist, so they get it double. And we try at HEMAYAT that we have a conversation after the therapy. So we have also a therapy with the translators, but still it's a high risk. And yeah, in your private life you have to do nice things. Don't look at scary movies and all that kind of stuff. So enjoy life as much as possible.
Thanks. If I just may come in on one point when we speak about victims of torture, I think, of course, there is the treatment side as a major side. But in our work, for example, at the OMCT, there are also other ways how you can value victims, how you can give a face back and the dignity back to victims, for example. I mean, as we speak, we have in Tunisia an art exhibition, a photo exhibition, which shows the pictures of various torture victims at different times of Tunisian post-independence history. And very different people, be it ordinary criminals, be it political opponents, be it communist opponents, be it the Islamists, everybody. And it's done by a French photographer who took the photos, and then there's a testimony of the person concerned. And what is so important about it in the process, I think, is it gives a face back to victims of torture. Of course, it's all with their consent. And when you see these big portraits with the description, it's actually quite powerful, because torture wanted to break these people and giving that type of dignity back. So in fact, there are many more things we can do about torture to restore victims' dignity in a way. And I just wanted to share this with you. But Manfred, there were a couple of questions on, is the light or the future brighter when it comes to civil remedies or the European Court of Human Rights? Is there more hope? We want to hear something about hope. And I think another point was about overcrowding.
I think usually I'm quite good, but in spreading hope. But I think again, if I try to be honest in responding to the questions, it's not very polite. Ian, of course. Yeah, if you win your case against the Russian Federation before the European Court of Human Rights, usually you get some money to pay your lawyers, and perhaps a little bit more. But my experience is torture victims are not interested in money. They are interested in rehabilitation, whatever, psychological, medical rehabilitation. They might be interested in the truth, in justice. But not in money. The European Court doesn't give you anything else than money. The Inter-American Court is a little bit better in terms of reparation. But the main problem is already earlier. And if I just give you an example of Austria, where we are sitting here, we had a case for the Austrians. Omofuma is probably still well known. He was a Nigerian who was to be sent back to Nigeria, and because he didn't really want to go back, they just cut his mouth. And on the flight from Vienna to Sofia, he died. That was a big scandal. And then they established what we called the Human Rights Advisory Council in the Ministry of Interior, with 6 visiting commissions, and saying that we have to look into police violence and, of course, also the detention facilities of the police. So I was the head of one of those 6 commissions, and we had access, unannounced visits, access like an MPM, but only for the police. I think we achieved a little bit in improving the conditions of detention for foreigners, these kind of things. But the big thing was, what can we do against police ill treatment? In Austria, you have about 500 on average, 500 claims of victims that the police have ill-treated them. And perhaps 3 of those come to the courts, and then usually there's an acquittal because of lack of evidence. Why is there lack of evidence? Because it's very, very difficult to prove torture, because torture takes place somewhere in secret. And again, what you discussed before, we have in Austria, as in India, this esprit de corps. If there is an allegation of torture or ill treatment by the police, the first reaction of the police is up to the Minister of Interior. That can't be true. We have to defend ourselves. We have to stick together. We have to fight this. It's not the other way around of saying, it might be true, let's have an independent investigation. And that is in all the countries where I have been. There are very, very few good practices. The UK is quite all right, in a few other countries, what I call an independent police. Because usually torture is carried out by the police, and it's a crime. So if somebody is complaining, they immediately say, yeah, that's up to the prosecutor's office, it's a crime, so we have to take it seriously, the prosecutor has to investigate. But the prosecutor is using the police to investigate against the police, and it just doesn't work. So the simplest way is saying we need an independent, at the same time effective, independent organization with all the police powers of arrest, of whatever the police has as powers in investigating crime. For 10 years we tried it. We said, this is the big elephant, that's the big problem. We don't think that there are 500 cases of torture in Austria, but perhaps it's 10. But we want to know, after these 10 years, I would like to know how big the risk is to be ill-treated. I still don't know it, because there is no effective investigation. And if there's no effective investigation, then you can go to the courts, but you won't. It's very, very difficult to win the case. So we had one case that was brought to the criminal courts because the evidence was so obvious, but again, they got for torture, serious torture of a Gambian citizen, and they got 6 or 8 months suspended sentence. That is how torture is treated in Austria. And so I think it is. It would be very important to say there is a civil remedy, but only after it has been investigated. There is this general comment now of the Committee Against Torture on Article 14. Article 14 is a beautiful provision. In reality, it's that. If we tried to say torture rehabilitation centers need to be financed by the European Union, by our states, because there is an obligation also of Austria as a state party to the Convention Against Torture to provide an effective remedy and reparation, including rehabilitation, to victims of torture, wherever they have been tortured. They say, no, it's nice that we are already allowing them to come to Austria, but of course it's not our obligation that they get rehabilitation. It should be HEMAYAT. They should do it on voluntary work. They should work without any money. So it's very, very difficult to really implement the right to reparation for torture victims. And of course the US have shown us perfectly that they prevented the courts even to take it up because it might lead to some kind of state secrets, and it's better than not to touch it at all. not one person, as you know, who has been tortured or when did it or whatever by the US has received 1 cent of compensation and much less rehabilitation, etc. Very quickly to Rina, as I said before, many people feel that the prison conditions are worse than torture. It has to do also with the retributive system of justice in so many countries. You're just locking people away without any kind of idea of rehabilitation or a life after prison, resocialization. And you have still this in all the post-Soviet countries. So as more serious your crime is, as more you are actually not only locked away, but for instance, solitary confinement. In Mongolia, for instance, if you got 30 years in prison, then it was automatic that you get solitary confinement. Can you imagine 30 years in solitary confinement? It's just locking you away. Of course, for these people, and many of them said we are innocent because we were tortured and then we just confessed the crime which we didn't commit. I don't know whether it's true, but there are certainly many innocent people there. As I said, for many people, the prison conditions are worse than the physical torture that they have experienced.
Thanks, Manfred. If I can just comment in a way, abuse my role as a moderator and comment on one first point that you made, which I think is also very much the experience at the OMCT. We often support cases to the UN treaty bodies where you can complain about torture, for example. And we did so also in countries where at the time we submitted these complaints, there was not much hope that there would be implementation. We had cases on Libya under Gaddafi, under Ben Ali on Tunisia. Yet, in our experience, what the people that we represented at these treaty bodies, at the Committee Against Torture or the Human Rights Committee, what they were looking for most was the recognition that there was a violation, that somebody in the world authoritatively recognized what happened. They had no illusion that there would be any compliance of the Libyan state on this, or of the Tunisian state. Even so far that we had one Tunisian case when the revolution came, he said, no, he doesn't want to pursue the remedy because he doesn't want the new state to pay for it. Sadly, the case is now pursued because not much has happened. But I think it's important that recognition can be in many forms, and the remedy can be, in that sense, very successful. And I cannot subscribe more to the need for independent investigations and also independent prosecutors' offices. Like Manfred, I've worked quite a bit on the counterterrorism side of the torture challenge. And the only cases that went forward, I think, were cases where the prosecutors in the respective countries had a status that was relatively independent. And I think we have to work on that if you really want to have a prosecutor saying it's my ethical professional duty, not because I'm a human rights lawyer, but because I'm a prosecutor. This is a crime, I investigate, and there's no political interference. But Henri, I think you were targeted quite a bit with a whole series of questions about India.
I'm now happy I'm coming after Manfred. 500 cases of police ill treatment and 10 years of work, and you're still groping in the dark. And I'm purposely saying this because I trust all the systems that you said. Purposely, I took a position which is quite different. But for these systems to function, you need an honest society. And we don't have one. And that is our problem. And I'll give you small examples so that people can understand what I'm saying as not being some extreme point of view. We have the Paris Principles for National Human Rights Institutions. It is only as long as independent people are appointed to the Commission that the Commission can be effective. The Commission perhaps that you have been introduced to or you have met in Geneva many years ago is completely different from the Commission we have today. Recently, we have a sitting police officer made a member of the National Human Rights Commission. We have a Supreme Court judge who served on the Supreme Court for 1,300 days and delivered only 10 judgments. Don't get me wrong, 1,300 days, 10 judgments, handpicked by the selection committee to serve on the National Human Rights Commission. And therefore, I'm talking about a system of honesty for that transparency to work. And that honesty in the system is not there, any amount of transparency will not work. For 20 years in positions which are meant for civil society representatives on the National Human Rights Commission, we've had retired officers of the Indian Administrative Service, retired officers of the Indian Police Service, retired officers of the Indian Foreign Service, retired officers of the Indian Forest Service who are occupying positions on the National Human Rights Commissions as people knowledgeable and experienced in human rights. And that is the reason I'm not able to accept that in some countries, jurisdictions where accountability of governance doesn't exist, these mechanisms will not work. My prosecutor in my country is a political appointee. And as long as he or she is a political appointee, there are no ethical positions of a prosecutor. The only ethical question that he or she is loyal to the party which appointed him. And that is why the criminal justice system is getting off. Now, going back to this case of the girl raped in Delhi on 16th of December, I want to recall something which is very connected to what we are talking. 1.5 months prior to that, were the UPR2 responses of the government of India to the recommendations that the global community made. Don't get me wrong, all recommendations that were made on violence against women to India by different state parties were all not accepted by India. This was in November 2012. Exactly 1 month later, this incident takes place in Delhi. 7 days after the incident, the government of India appoints this Justice Verma committee to look into violence against women. The international community reminded you of your obligation on violence against women, you negated it. You projected yourself as a great democracy which did not need this advice from the global community. 7 days later after the incident and 1.5 months after you negated those recommendations, you appoint a committee. And that committee comes up with a 600-page report in exactly 30 days. And you play politics with that report. What is the scenario today? That was 15th of December. Between January and March, in the same city of Delhi, there have been 350 cases of rape. Believe me, 350 cases of rape. I'm conscious. My own daughter has now moved to Delhi. And the first thing CNN IVN, where she works, tells her is, please keep your pepper spray on yourself because that is the way you can protect yourself. So this is the amount of violence that takes place in the capital of the city, which country negated the entire recommendations made by the global community in the UPR2 process. And I'm purposely saying this because it matters. And this particular case that you are talking about had a protest movement, a media glaze, so everybody was watching it. These other 350 are very, very ordinary people. They don't have one media which is able to cover their stories, except some small coverages in the newspaper. And the police are in no manner equipped to be able to handle this case in investigation and in terms of the victim and what happens to the victim. And I thought it is important to mention this in particular because you raised it. The court case is proceeding. The court case is proceeding. There's no doubt about it. And because of the media glaze, in this particular case, there will be a conviction. We can predict it. But that is not a guarantee that this will happen to all the other 350 victims who are there in the queue for their own prosecutions. And that is what we are concerned about. I think coming to the second question, even before coming to the second question, also to touch upon a question that was asked to my colleague, I learnt from victims. Although I am a lawyer, I learnt from victims that they are not interested in me as a lawyer. They are interested in me as somebody who is able to hold their hand. And if I'm able to convey it, and many of the survivors whom we have worked have said, we are sick. And it took me a long time to understand what sickness they had. They will come back after 2 weeks and say, I have a spinal pain. They'll come back after 2 weeks and say, I have a heart pain. And every time we were so foolish in terms of our human rights work that we thought we had to refer them to a doctor. It was a visit to Medical Foundation in UK about 15 years ago that I understood that I was sick as a lawyer who could never be able to understand the pain and suffering that victims of torture undergo. I had to learn more in the process than be able to do anything more to them. Few cases we have survived. 23 years of trial in court. 23 years of trial in court for a small conviction of 6 months. 10 years, 13 years. Imagine protecting that victim for 10 and 13 years. That is the most important challenge for us. Protecting witnesses in a society, that is more important for us. Ensuring that we have a prosecution assistant, our own assistant to assist the prosecution. And in terms of court dynamics and ego, you know how difficult it is because the prosecutor is very upset that there is somebody to assist him or her. And all this only to ensure, and then finally to bank and ensure that the judge is not corrupt. And if the judge is ultimately corrupt, you lose that case after 13 years, 10 years. I have a case of, after 14 years losing, the son who was doing his schooling had become a lawyer and he was also assisting the prosecution. And we lost the case. And we are now on appeal. So I think this whole thing of learning from victims and standing with victims is quite important.
Absolutely.
On death penalty, yes, that was politics in India. Justice Verma Committee, before the Justice Verma Committee, all the women's organization, irrespective of their political affiliation, said no death penalty for cases of rape. They were unanimous. Justice Verma accepted, and the entire committee accepted. But politically, because elections matter and votes matter, and because the public view is completely different, they have made it clear that death penalty will be there and that penalty will continue. And therefore, we always feel that when you go to the public, we are at a loss because the public asks us questions. And they ask us, how long are you to wait till this process? You yourself say it takes 23 years. You say it takes 10 years. Why the hell should we wait for these 10 years and 12 years? Best is to kill them, extrajudicial killings. These are answers by the public. And torture, why should it be wrong? Because your criminal justice system is taking so long to find justice ultimately for the victims. And I think therefore these are the arguments which ultimately remain. The last question was on defenders and Masoom and the case against Masoom. I am an accused in that case. See, and what is this case? This is a case of a public hearing conducted as a part of our national program on torture, where we did it in all the states, and that was in the state of West Bengal. And because we conducted the public hearing, there was a criminal case charged against people who were connected with the program. Masoom happened to be in West Bengal, therefore he was arrested. I happened to be far away from West Bengal, therefore I am not arrested. I have a non-bailable warrant against me pending. On the 8th and 9th of July, I have to go to West Bengal. But in the criminal justice system, we know how to manage these things. We know it takes several years. If I went and appeared before court, then my passport can be impounded. They can tell me I should not travel outside. The next time you call me for a meeting of the OMCT, I may not be able to come. And therefore, we don't appear in court. But once the trial starts, then the whole ball game starts. And I think many of us, I have several other cases against me, which are also pending in court. But these are part and parcel of our work as human rights defenders. I think as human rights defenders, which we said, I don't know whether I said it here or somewhere else, criminalization of the human rights defender is a major tactic of our governments. And when I say our governments, it's not India. Many Asian states believe that trumping up charges against you, making you face cases, and I said it there is an anti-nuclear movement which is non-violent in nature, which is totally non-violent in nature in South India. And that movement and its leaders have 75,000 cases registered for people in a 15 square kilometer area. 8,000 of them are offenses of waging war against the state. And 3,000 of them are cases of sedition. Who is violent? Is the state violent or is the citizen violent? And therefore, while all these mechanisms are to be welcomed, transparency is to be, as a society, we need to be transparent. As a society, we need to believe in governance, then it will work. If it doesn't work in Austria, how do you imagine it will ever work in India? And that is why I was very, very safe coming after you for once. Very, very happy to come after you. I say it with great respect. I say it with a lot of pain. And as you finish the last session, I say it with pain because we say it to our own country. And we say it not because we don't like our country. We say it because we like our country, we like the people, and we want to ensure that these protections become meaningful. The way out, is there a hope? We all work with hope as human rights defenders. Mm-hmm. But in reality, the hope is diminishing, and that is the truth.
Thanks, Henri. And in fact, I have to do a confession. And confessions are always bad when it comes to torture, because any system that is based on confession usually triggers torture or ill treatment. But I see that there are drinks afterwards and that we have to come to an end. And I had promised to you that there will be a second round of public questions, but I'm afraid we have pretty much exhausted our time. So I would, in violation of what I had announced, I would like to have a last word from each panelist about what is the thing in the next 10 years you think that needs to change and can change. You see, I really want the sign of hope, so this is the last chance I give to you. And maybe we start.
I would say I hope that we can close HEMAYAT in about 10 years or even earlier. That we don't need HEMAYAT anymore. So, yeah, we have to make a mindset here in this country, especially here in Austria, all over the world, but I talk. It's for me Austria at the moment. Yeah, there's a lot of work, but I'm hopeful.
Manfred.
Perhaps you come before.
Oh yeah, we turn around.
I really am someone who places a lot of hope in good human rights education for different sections, which is victim-centered. Yeah. A victim-centered human rights education for different sections of society, not only children in schools. That is one aspect. But a victim-centered human rights education, which is systemic in nature in every institution that we have in the country, is the sign of hope. Mm-hmm. It is from victims and being sensitive to victims and making human rights something that will reach the victims. That is the process through which I think hope can be generated. And you need a determination to do that. It is very, very costly. But I'm hopeful that it is possible. After 15 years of working for human rights education in schools, a very violent Tamil society has taught the government that unless we are in I come from a state where the politicians are gathering together saying that a boy and a girl coming from different communities cannot marry each other. Mm-hmm. In 2013, I'm not talking about 10 years ago, I'm talking about 2013, and this is trying to be hot politics today. And that is the state at which leads to violence of killing people, several lakhs of property being destroyed, etc. And the government now understands that if equality is not taught to young people in schools, this is what our society will move towards. Therefore, there is hope in what I'm saying. Human rights education, which is victim-centered, is a hopeful sign for different institutions to move. Judges of the Supreme Court who have become National Human Rights Commission members, or diplomats who have become members of the National Human Rights Commission, have confessed that only after 4 years of working in the commission, they have realized that throughout their diplomatic career, they were lying, and what was provided to them were lies. And if that is a learning that these people have got, I think larger society will definitely benefit from a victim-centered human rights education. Thank you.
Thanks. You helped me to become positive again. Again, I have to link it a little bit now to why we are all here, celebrating Vienna plus 20. But for me, the Vienna World Conference on Human Rights really was using a window of opportunity to really create something new. And I think quite much has been achieved in the 1990s or in those 20 years. But now we have totally new challenges. And the main challenge that I see is this enormous implementation gap. We have beautiful standards. We don't need better standards. We have beautiful monitoring mechanisms all together, NGOs, IGOs, etc. So we also know what the real situation is. And that makes it so much worse because we know so much. Those are the standards, that's the reality on the ground. So to close this implementation gap. So that's for me the big challenge. And I do see the recent developments. I know the Arab Spring is now not anymore as popular as 2 years ago and because of Syria and whatever. But still, I think it is a paradigm change that again people go on the streets, what we're seeing now in Brazil, what we're seeing today in Turkey, etc. People have enough from this kind of not only human rights violations, but kind of all those lies that we are confronted with every day. And I also see all the economic, financial, and whatever other crisis in principle as a chance, as a new window of opportunity. And that's why I am, despite the fact that all the diplomats that I'm talking about say this is a bad idea, I am in favor of a Third World Conference on Human Rights in 2018. Why? Because I think we have 5 years' time to prepare something, to realize what are the big challenges of the 21st century, and to develop ideas. The World Code of Human Rights is one idea. There might be other much better ideas, but to really give it a chance to build up a process leading to a new World Conference on Human Rights, somewhere in Africa or somewhere in the Arab states, to take ownership also of the global human rights movement and responsibility, and perhaps coming, it's this awareness changing which has to come from the international community. You can't do bits and pieces on the ground, but I think in general saying this is totally unacceptable that we have worked for such a long period of time to establish those standards, and they are simply neglected, and we are used to the fact that they are neglected. We have to take them more seriously and thereby close or narrow down the implementation gap. So I do think that the time has come to be somewhat more also self-confident as civil society, and not always being told by diplomats, but now it's a bad time because if you do something then the standards might be lower. No, let's give it a try.
Thanks, Manfred, and also for being positive. And if I may just add in closing also that thank you, you brought it back actually to the title of the meeting today. Nothing can justify torture under any circumstances, and then from legal prohibition to enforcement and implementation. And I think, if I think about the next 10 years, now that we have the standard, for me it is about closing this implementation gap. And I actually think that these international standards we have can help in this process quite considerably. And I think we also need to recognize that in the last 20 years, maybe 20 years ago when the Vienna World Conference took place, these mechanisms that we have with UN treaty bodies, etc., they were quite elitist. Only a few people were accessing them. We at the OMCT, we work with partner organizations on the ground in coming to Geneva, presenting the reports, etc. I think the system has become much more democratic today and much more universal. What we have to do in the next 10 years, I think, is the next step back, that the discussion is not only in Geneva, but in India, in Delhi, in various parts of the world. We have to bring these international mechanism really to the ground. The second point I think that I take from this discussion is really the importance of the public, because this is, I think, something I've seen in my work in Eastern Europe, in the countries where you had transition that worked, there was a public opinion against torture and similar violations. In some other countries we did reforms, but we never got public support for it, and that's why we didn't achieve it. And I think the public is also important in the West And we didn't discuss much about counterterrorism, but we at the OMCT feel that one of the impacts of 9/11 that is still there is that the discourse over 10 years that was quite aggressive on counterterrorism and human rights and torture has left traces that the public at large, at least in Western countries, is maybe not as robustly responding to torture than it should be, and we should think how to rebuild this. But I think there are possibilities. Human rights education, very important. But for me personally, as representing an organization that works with partner organizations on the ground, I'm often asked, and this is maybe the final word I say, I'm often asked, is it not totally frustrating that you work on torture? And I say no, because I meet the people like Henri who work on torture and other human rights violations in their country. And I think that is an enormous inspiration. And we also in Western countries should be aware of the threats and the difficulties that human rights defenders work in. And we can work to protect them. I mean, this is one of the work we do. We protect human rights defenders when they are threatened. And I think there is much that can be done. But that should give us hope. We now have a very strong human rights community in most places around the world on torture. We didn't have that, I think, the same way 20 years ago. And some of the reactions, threats to human rights defenders we see today is because governments know that there are these people. They know that they're right. I remember a couple of weeks ago at the UN Human Rights Council, the German President Gauck was speaking, and he himself, being a dissident and having a human rights record, was saying to this audience, yes, I've heard about challenges to universality. When we were confronting the Eastern German government at the time, they said, oh, this is Western standards, this is something foreign. But I saw the fear in their eyes. So he saw, they know I'm right, and they're afraid. And I think that's what we see. But we should take this positive emotion that we have people fighting on the ground, they do it for their countries, they're great human rights people, but they're also great patriots in that sense, and I think that should give us hope. And with that, I want to close and thank everybody, you for coming, the organizers and hosts for hosting us here, and I should also announce that there are some drinks at the end of the room so that we can continue our discussions. But in particular, I'd like to thank our three panelists, and I think we should give a big applause to them.
It was good listening to you and listening to you. I agree with whatever you said. That, our reality also. I know. Because you're speaking the truth. I should have.